Welcome to Psychological First Aid, Lessons from the Disaster Response World. My name is Dr. Craig Katz from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. This presentation will include some introductory concepts, then we'll talk about psychological first aid in some detail, some related concepts, and then we'll summarize it all. I do want to start out by thanking my colleagues, Dr. Ed Cantor and Carol North, for providing some of the content and slides or versions thereof that I'm presenting today. Thank you. So, what is a crisis? Webster, the dictionary, defines it as a turning point. Sheehy describes it as a passage, and the English word is derived from the Greek krinon, meaning to decide. The Chinese term for crisis, weiji, which I'm hopefully pronouncing correctly, is actually composed of two characters, and I think this is a very meaningful point, which is that crisis consists of danger and opportunity. Those are the two characters that make up the term weiji, and is, I think, very helpful for us all to think about a crisis in terms of a danger, but also hopefully at some point an opportunity, although opportunity can sometimes be hard to see, especially early on. So, the generally accepted definition of crisis is a temporary state of upset and disorganization characterized by an inability to cope with a particular situation using customary methods of problem solving and by the potential for a radically positive or negative outcome. And again, there's an emphasis on the possibility of positive and negative outcomes. And it's really a kind of a state of disequilibrium where things have to kind of shake out and go in a certain direction. So yes, the emphasis is on inability to cope, not being able to use customary methods, and even the possibility, hopefully the possibility, that a crisis results in something positive. Another way to think of crisis is stress, and I like to use some images to talk about stress and related concepts. So here would be an image of stress, kind of bending in a ferocious wind, bending, as you see the trees here, in what look like hurricane force winds. Trauma differs from stress, whereas in stress, we usually have the ability to restore things to balance or equilibrium. In trauma, the stress overwhelms one's ability to cope and reassert equilibrium. So you're overwhelmed and you need to turn to external resources. So as an image, you might say, if we're going with the tree image from earlier, trauma leads to something broken within the individual. And then disaster is trauma at the level of the community. It's one that overwhelms not just individuals, but also their community. And that's depicted in this image, which I'm afraid hasn't come out very clearly, though, of multiple downed trees after a storm. Also important to think about trauma as something that radiates out across the community in a disaster. I often think of it like radiation. It's kind of invisible and sees its way being passed from individual to individual, with those individuals at the heart, the source of the trauma, the so-called ground zero, experiencing the most, but then it kind of can also disperse out over the community. And that relates to a different concept called the disaster community. So at the center of the disaster community are direct victims, although probably better hopefully called survivors. Then next of kin are the bereaved, service providers, support providers, and the community at large. And all these different rings of a so-called disaster community can be potentially affected, presumably those at the center the most affected and those at the periphery the least, but that's not always the case. But this is a good general concept to be reminding us of all the different populations within a community that could be affected by disaster. Now, people's response to crisis can vary, and in this slide you see that there's a potentially dysfunctional response. And the only thing I don't like about this slide that was given to me is it goes straight from the event to dysfunctional response, and of course events don't always have to lead to a dysfunctional response, but in this case, we're talking about a crisis. So a dysfunctional response potentially then leading to some kind of decompensation, and then hopefully a recovery And then in the recovery, you can see the level of functioning that somebody comes back to, maybe even higher than before, back to their old self or at a lower level of functioning. Those are all the different potential outcomes from a crisis. And of course, in the middle there is the intervention, which is where those of us participating in this training come in, intervening in order to enhance people's recovery or reduce the likelihood of decompensation in the first place. Some assumptions about crises or stress. Crisis is based on the individual. It is, although most crises, of course, look like something that you could see with your eyes, see in the news or witness or experience yourself out there in the world, there really actually exists in the mind of an individual. And it's always striking how some events which seem clearly to be a crisis for one person, and you would think it would be for anyone, for other people are not. So that's important to keep in mind, the individualized nature of crises. The point being that coping mechanisms prove inadequate. Usual coping mechanisms prove inadequate. Again, the crisis can result from, well, I should say again, crises not only can have positive or negative outcomes, but also can result from positive or negative events. Even positive events can cause such a great state of equilibrium that it's a crisis. They may be situational or developmental, meaning something that happens in life, such as, say, a hurricane or a pandemic, or developmental, having to do with a certain stage of life and the crises that those present. Of course, no one is immune to crisis, and we hope and believe and practice that early interventions can help to restore function and resolve a crisis quickly and maybe for the best. So psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is a evidence-informed preventative intervention. And what that means is it's not necessarily scientifically studied or based, but a bunch of experts got together and all agreed that these are as good as we get from what we know from practice and study about ways to support and people after crises and facilitate their recovery. These are manuals developed, excuse those abbreviations there. NCTSN stands for the National Child Trauma Stress Network, and the NCPTSD is the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, the latter being a federal agency. Psychological first aid at this point is widely disseminated, especially since 9/11. It's been adapted by the American Red Cross. It targets everyone of all ages. It actually, in great detail, can be modularized, have tip sheets, have scripts involved in it. But we're going to talk about it in a more general way and not such a scripted, detailed way. Psychological first aid really derives from a concept that many of us are familiar with, perhaps from college level psychology or elsewhere, and that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That people have a range of needs, and that our most basic are physiologic and safety needs. And as you go kind of higher up the pyramid, we get to more characteristically human needs, such as belonging needs, esteem needs, and at the peak, the needs for actualization. Although I should preface that this hierarchy has been criticized as being too Western and not cross-cultural enough. But nonetheless, this is what psychological first aid is really, I think, premised on and gets at, which is you got to start at the base and work your way up when you're helping somebody in crisis. So the National Institutes of Mental Health here in the United States, after 9/11, when this got so much attention, endorsed psychological first aid and put out a manual on it. And these are the basic elements in psychological first aid as defined by the NIMH: providing for basic needs, protecting from further harm. Again, if you think about the base of the Maslow's hierarchy, that's where that is. Reduce agitation and arousal, support those in most distress, keep families together and provide support, provide information and foster communication, orient to available services, and use effective risk communication techniques. Those are all the elements of psychological first aid, and you can see that many of them, if not most of them, don't need to be practiced by a mental health professional. They can be practiced by most people. In fact, many people are actually providing psychological first aid by the things they do in response to a disaster without even knowing that they are doing what we would call an element of psychological first aid. So again, the National Center for PTSD and the National Child Trauma Stress Network have adopted psychological first aid as an evidence-informed treatment. And they put out what's called the Psychological First Aid Field Operations Guide. And what I'm going to do now is go through the different elements that they put into their psychological first aid step-by-step approach. So first is contact and engagement. So when one is in a disaster scene, the first thing, of course, to think about, if you're there to provide support, provide psychological first aid, is who are you helping? And there are all sorts of people, if you think back to the image of the disaster community, all sorts of people that need help. There are the survivors, the bereaved, responders, the economically impacted, the community at large, slightly different terms than I used earlier in the graphic on the disaster community, but all the different, really essentially the different rungs in those circles. And you could see that their needs span safety needs, physical needs, medical needs, and mental health needs. And while one doesn't necessarily walk around with this chart at a disaster scene, this is what you should be thinking about in terms of who you're going to be helping and on what level of needs you're going to help them with. So this is actually an image from the Family Assistance Center right after 9/11, which for anyone who was there was an enormous, one of the enormous piers on the west side of Manhattan, Pier 94, where all sorts of services were set up, right? And if you show up as a mental health professional or the like, intending to provide psychological first aid, you kind of have to figure out where in all this you're going to fit in. And this is just one aisle in this enormous building. And you got to think about integrating yourself into the services, often approaching people by having informal conversation, indirect inquiries, and then linking people up with agencies. And to give an example from 9/11, what we would often do when we were there at the Family Assistance Center was sit down in the cafeteria that was set up there and introduce ourselves, usually to somebody who was sitting alone, having a cup of coffee, bring our cup of coffee, sit down and start talking with them, being sure to identify ourselves as a mental health professional, usually by our ID, although always using our first name, not referring to ourselves with our professional title, explaining why we're there and striking up a conversation. And that's providing basic support. Now, most people in a disaster setting, or many people, aren't going to go on to need anything more than a little bit of support, if anything, and aren't going to need down the road actual more sophisticated, outright mental health care, or psychiatric care. But this is a good list of the risk factors for those who we might be sitting and having coffee with at a disaster setting or talking with informally, who are likely to go on to develop problems with post-disaster psychopathology in the long run. And what we worry about is people develop, I'll repeat this later, but probably the big three of psychiatric problems that people develop from trauma and disaster, or major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and recurrent alcohol use problems. And these are the factors that identify who is most likely to develop those. Those who experience the biggest dose of trauma with enough trauma, people can be unfortunately induced to develop any one of those psychiatric conditions, even if what they bring to the table prior to that is low risk and otherwise mentally healthy. But many of the other bullets involve other aspects that the people bring to the table besides their exposure, and that is prior exposure to trauma, such as disaster, and especially having had problematic coping with that trauma or disaster, having a prior psychiatric history. Again, more likely a risk factor if it's a psychiatric history where they received inadequate or no treatment. Having problems in life before the disaster is actually a very big risk factor. If you're having problems in your life before, it makes sense, and it's been well established that you are more likely to suffer psychiatrically after a disaster. Lack of social support after is a huge one. Feeling unsupported is definitely something that can tip somebody in the direction of a psychiatric problem. Secondary stresses, an example of this might be suffering job loss after a disaster, or being unstably housed. That would be a secondary stress that just perpetuates problems, even if the initial exposure was low or not as high as others. And then there are some we call non-modifiable risk factors, something you can't do anything about necessarily, being female, middle-aged, and an ethnic minority. This is just a picture that exemplifies this point. This is a picture from post-tsunami Sri Lanka in early 2005, and this is a picture of a fisherman's village along a coast that got walloped by the tsunami in Sri Lanka. And what you'll see in this picture is pockmarks on the facade of this cottage. And what those pockmarks represent, if you know the history of Sri Lanka, is from shelling by the government from boats offshore prior to the tsunami, because prior to the tsunami, there was a civil war going on, and this was a village that was being was occupied by the rebels known as the Tamil Tigers. And so I show this picture because this is a community that I would expect to do worse after something like a tsunami because of those pockmarks, because they had civil conflict in terms of conflict with the government prior to the event. So they are poorly set up to do well psychologically after the tsunami. So having pre-trauma vulnerability, like those pockmarks in that wall, and then a disaster exposure leads to post-trauma psychopathology, and that's precisely what we want to avoid. Okay, safety and comfort. So this is a scene from an earthquake in El Salvador that we responded to as mental health professionals, and we got to a town called San Augustine, and this is what we saw. It was an earthquake. To us, it looked like the place had been bombed in a major war. And we showed up there with our mental health surveys and medications ready to treat people psychiatrically. But when you see this, you have to realize that what people need first, again, thinking back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is the basics. So what we wound up doing is going back into the Capitol, buying food for many of the people who were sitting, waiting for big relief agencies, of which we were not, to show up with food. And we went and just bought food and sterno and matches and fresh water, and came back the next day and put our trauma scales away, because they were really at the base of Maslow's hierarchy and needing the most basic of needs, food and nurturance. Another element of psychological first aid is stabilization. So this brings up the topic of medications in the acute aftermath of a trauma or disaster. And by acute, I mean days to weeks. And this is a quote from a paper way back in 2003 from several colleagues, one of whom is here at Mount Sinai, Steve Southwick. And what they said back then is still the case now, and that is there's not a whole lot of research supporting if and how to use medications to help people deal with their acute reactions to trauma, such as acute stress disorder. But I have to say that despite the fact that there's not a lot of science to support it, in our experience, there are some meds that are very useful, particularly benzodiazepines, such as diazepam, or people know it as Valium, or Ativan, or lorazepam, Klonopin, or clonazepam. They are actually pretty useful in the immediate aftermath to help calm people and support them. Sometimes people just need hypnotic agents, sleep medications like Zolpidem or Zolpidem. And in rare cases, you need antipsychotics. Sometimes people have brief psychotic reactions, or used antipsychotics before the event and need their supply restored. But that's much less common. I would say of all these, in experience, benzodiazepines are extremely useful things to have around, although some people find that to be a controversial point and don't think you should use medications in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster. And I would say there's no evidence, good scientific evidence for or against using them or not. And I'm making a recommendation based on experience that it is useful. And there's also a hope that we can come up with medications that you can give people, like you would give them sublingual nitro to prevent chest pain from becoming a heart attack. That you could give a medicine to somebody and prevent their trauma experience from becoming something like post-traumatic stress disorder. And these are all the different medicines that are discussed, but we're not even there yet. So some general principles. And by the way, I mention pharmacotherapy, not because you as a practitioner of psychological first aid will necessarily be providing it or need to provide it, but you should be aware that some people may need it. And if you are not in a position to prescribe, then you can always consider referring somebody if basically they are so acutely distressed that your sense is that they might benefit from something like a benzodiazepine and anti-anxiety medication. And generally, when we're talking about providing medicines, we're not talking about a long-term regimen. We're talking about short-term, a few days, just to help kind of get people sort of heading in the right direction. And that's what we did after 9/11. We gave out 2-3 days worth of lorazepam, or 2-3 days worth of zaleplon, a sleep medication. I would say that when it comes to prescribing in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster, one has to be careful about why you're doing it. You know, just because you want to do something or because you think the person needs it. And the basic rules of prescribing, if you are a prescriber, don't get suspended just because life is in chaos after disaster. You still need to check out and make sure that it's not going to interact with any of their current medications, that they don't have any medical problems that are a contraindication to the meds, and of course, make sure they don't have any drug allergies that would preclude your prescribing it. Fourth element of psychological first aid is information gathering about current needs and concerns. Now, this brings up the topic of debriefing, and you may be familiar with the debriefing concept. The idea of debriefing is that PTSD is generally thought of in theoretical terms as a disorder where memories are inadequately, excuse the spelling there, inadequately should be one word, inadequately encoded into words. So if that is what PTSD, a problem with putting an event, an overwhelming event into words, into a story, then talking about the event should help. That's the whole basis for talking about psychological debriefing. So the evidence for debriefing, and I should actually say what debriefing typically is. Typically, in its original form, which started in the military and then sort of made its way out to popular culture, so that when you're in a post-disaster setting, we often find that it's very common for people to say, "Can you debrief me? Can you do a debriefing?" And it's not always clear what they mean. They probably, I'm sure, don't mean the formal psychological debriefing model that was discussed, but the way you should think about debriefing is something that's typically done in a group, but could be done individually. And what it involves is, classically, is getting people in the group to go around and each talk about what they did in the event, and then talk about how they feel. And you basically go around one by one. It's usually facilitated. And the idea is to kind of get it off of your chest and to put it into some words. Generally speaking, people feel good about debriefing when they go through them. But actually the research to support it is pretty limited, even equivocal. There aren't any like randomized controlled studies. And in fact, one study from after 9/11, when this began to get so much attention, suggested that debriefing may have no benefit and sometimes even harm individuals. And some of the challenges with doing group debriefings is if you have group members that had experienced different traumas, then they may be traumatizing one another by telling their story about their particular trauma. Debriefing during an ongoing trauma sometimes can worsen the trauma exposure. That's not always the case, but it may. And there's sometimes the problem when you have debriefing groups that individuals who are grieving are thrown together with traumatized individuals, and that's too heterogeneous of a group, two different kinds of groups. So the take-home, psychological debriefing is opportunity to share one story and experience with others, to be heard, and to help start to put a story together so that makes some meaning out of things. And it's often, thought to be like a one-time only intervention. Sometimes it can be more than one. And it's an opportunity for us as providers to maybe offer some psychoeducation depending upon what you hear, and to informally assess people. If you don't like the way someone looks in a so-called debriefing group, or what you could probably just call a support group, that's when we would refer them potentially for a more formal evaluation. We want to avoid strict models. There are strict models out there that tell you that there's a certain way to do it and it's the only way to do it. Those should be avoided. Again, it's basically a chance for people to share, be heard, and start to make some meaning of things. It's pretty straightforward in that sense. They should never be mandatory. That's probably the biggest thing. You should never make somebody talk right after a trauma if they don't want to, with the rare exception of people who are literally mute, and we've seen people become mute and nearly catatonic. That's a different story. But for the overwhelming majority of people, if they don't want to talk right afterwards, don't make them talk. If they do want to talk, it's an opportunity to help them and for us to apply our psychological skills. Okay, practical assistance. Again, this sort of gets a little back to the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But practical assistance is a key part of psychological first aid. I already spoke to it in terms of comfort and safety needs, but as a reminder, it's central. And this is actually something I took a photo of from after Hurricane Sandy out in the far Rockaways. So this is from November 2012. This was a newspaper that was talking about resources that were available to people in Brooklyn, South Queens, and Staten Island. This is like the front page. And I was just struck by it because I thought this list was like right out of psychological first aid. And so we're right out of the basic, the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I was impressed. Okay, connection with social support is a central part of psychological first aid. I don't think too much needs to be said about it, but just to drive the point home, we found that family associations often grow up after disasters. Like in New York, or even countrywide in the U.S., there's a 9/11 family association. I think there may even be more than one. And this is the way groups of survivors from a given event can come together, support one another emotionally, perhaps practically, perhaps for lobbying purposes. And this is from Japan, actually. Survivors of a terrorist attack on the subway there in 1995 in Tokyo, using sarin gas attack, they too formed family association. This was, I think, the woman on the right. They think both lost their husbands in that attack. The woman on the right, I believe, was the president at the time that I met her a few years back. But I bring this up because you can see the need for social support is cross-cultural. It goes across all different cultures and nations, and is, I always say, some free and abundant after a disaster, with people with good hearts, etc. And probably support is one of the, I would say, perhaps the most important part of psychological first aid, and our being there and being present, just being a compassionate listener, being there, I would say, as a fellow human being first, as a, let's say, health professional second, and then as a mental health professional third. First and foremost, you're there as a person. And when you're sitting down with someone, let's say at a cafeteria, at a center, if that's an option in any given event, you're there just like they are, person to person. It's all about first names, not about titles, etc. Information on coping is another incredibly important part of psychological first aid. Teaching people a bit about the emotions that they are experiencing or may be experiencing. And this I find to be one of the most important and useful concepts in all of psychiatry. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and what it basically talks about is the idea that as stress or anxiety increases on the x-axis, your performance increases up to a point. And when you get too stressed, too anxious, then you start to head into dysfunctions, right? So there's the idea of good stress and bad stress. And I think it's really important to teach people this because in an anxiety-inducing situation, you should be anxious. One should not be afraid to be anxious or embarrassed to be anxious. It's actually fuel in our tank. It's what gets us to perform under duress, and hopefully actually sharpens our skills and the acuity of our thinking and our motor skills to a point. And then what we want to do is teach people to be aware of bad stress, when it tips over in the wrong direction. Ultimately, as alluded to earlier, if people develop too much stress, are too exposed, have too many risk factors, or any one risk factor, let's say a whopping exposure, or had such big problems going on in their life before an event, that the event itself, the disaster, becomes like the last straw. These are the things that we look out for down the road, right? Psychological first aid is not targeted at these three. Psychological first aid really is targeted at preventing these three. Psychological first aid is something that's practiced in the immediate days to weeks. These conditions, unless they're recurrent and someone who previously had them, really are things that develop weeks to months later. And what we're trying to do is intervene during the early days to weeks to prevent these things from happening with psychological first aid. But we want to teach people about these things a little bit so that they can monitor themselves down the road and know when, let's say, the understandable anxiety and insomnia that they're experiencing day 3 after event, if it's still happening at day 33, maybe that requires clinical attention. Maybe that could be, for example, PTSD. It's also important not to diagnose people too early on and to teach people that having an anxious response to an event at like day 2 can't be PTSD. PTSD is something that actually you need to have symptoms of for a month. So we want to also tell people that nobody is trying to diagnose their distress right afterwards, or shouldn't be trying to diagnose their distress. These are things that happen down the road, if at all, and hopefully not if we all do this right. We also want to talk to people about grief, unfortunately such a major part of disastrous events, and talk to them about some of the feelings, somatic distress, having lots of images of the deceased, a lot of guilt feelings, sometimes being very angry, and being really kind of off kilter in terms of normal patterns of conduct, and normal routines are off, and those are all potentially quite normal parts of grief. It can be a real roller coaster, and that's what we want to teach people and help them to anticipate. We may also want to explain to them a little bit about what so-called grief work is, what they need to kind of do, which may happen naturally, or it may need help from others, from clergy, from mental health professionals, people in their life. But it just sounds kind of heavy. Emancipation from the bonds of the deceased, and loosening up some of those ties, which involves readjusting to the environment in which the deceased is missing. Usually that means adjusting, making the practical changes, and how life is different, and different things that they need to do now that they didn't do before, such as maybe tend to the bills or cook dinner, and then forming new relationships, establishing bonds with the living as bonds with the deceased begin to loosen up a little bit, although hopefully never are completely cut, but just loosened up. And I think this is the last element of psychological first aid, linkage with collaborative services. This doesn't really need a slide. What we need to do is link people up with the services that they need, right? If they're having housing issues, if they're having a health issue, our job is to link them up. And as a health or mental health professional, we actually have a lot of authority and sway in working with other agencies. If we connect somebody to them, make a referral, if it's a place where people are congregating, like a family assistance center, if we walk a person over to those services or pick up the phone for them, that really goes a long way to helping people, and is definitely an element of psychological first aid. Again, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we as health and mental health professionals, of course, can only do so much, but linking with others, we can also do. Okay, so that's psychological first aid. I want to talk about just some related concepts, and the main one is psychological first aid, PFA, for children. And it can be summarized actually in a much briefer way than all the other concepts I detailed for adults. Child PFA has been described in different ways, but it's basically listen, protect, and connect. That's it. And this is available, by the way, at ready.gov from the US government. Listen, right? Listen and pay attention to what children say and how they act. Pay more attention to them than you might normally, and look for signals. Kids aren't necessarily, depending upon their age, going to say, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. They may act it, they may show it in their play. They may show it in regressing and, let's say, doing more bedwetting or acting out more and having more behavior problems. That's paying attention and being aware of those things and thinking about what's going on, that these things are happening, right? Or what's going on, but that does indicate that the child is in distress and needs some help. Protect, oversee the children's day-to-day life in a way that provides them with an honest exposure to the situation without overexposing them. And this really can apply to adults too, but the basic point being children need information about events in these days and times. Children, depending upon their age, if they have access to a computer, a tablet, smartphone, they're going to have a lot of information anyway. It's our job as adults to make sure they have accurate information and they understand the information. On the other hand, we also want to not overexpose them and protect them from too much information, and while we're actually protecting ourselves from too much information. And the third part of psychological first aid for children and adolescents is connect. Connecting with friends, neighbors, teachers, and others in the community. Depending upon the event, this may be very hard. In an infectious outbreak, connecting with others may be a very big problem, although with the internet, it can definitely be a lot more manageable than it was ever before. So that's Listen, Protect, and Act. The World Health Organization has their own version, Look, Listen, Link, right? But it's more or less the same thing. Now I'll just talk a little bit about resilience. These are the resilience factors, resilience strategies that have been studied and written about by Dr. Dennis Charney and Dr. Steve Southwick. And these, they involve having realistic optimism, facing fear. I won't read all of them, but some of it is about spirituality. Again, you see social support there, physical fitness, being physically active and tending to one's health, even in the aftermath of disaster, and finding meaning, purpose somehow in the midst of catastrophe are all important elements of resilience. Now, what we hope, right, is that resilience, right, by definition, not hope, by definition, resilience reduces the proneness to developing things like PTSD and major depression, right? So if vulnerability and exposure both, you multiply them together and you get the risk of psychiatric problems down the road, resilience is in the denominator. It reduces the risk. You divide them by resilience, right? And this is not a formal math equation, but just a conceptual way to think about it. We want to promote people's resilience, reduce their exposure, because we, of course, can't modify their pre-event vulnerability. Now, what is resilience? It actually, people who study these things talk a lot about it. Is it, you may remember this image from earlier, is it about bending but not breaking? Is it about bouncing back to the way one once was, the way one was before? Is it bouncing back to better than ever? Right now, you're this beautiful palm tree in the tropics. People debate those things. Or, and this is the definition I like, and I heard this at a conference many years ago, and I found an image that I thought fit it, which is, is the traumatized individual kind of like a tree right at the coastline? The tree is battered by the winds and the salt and temperature extremes at the shore. But what happens is they develop into a really interesting tree with twists and turns and curves, and not just a perfectly symmetrical one. They have a story to tell, and it's woven into their character. I like that version of resilience. Anyway, to summarize, disaster mental health, these are slides from my colleague, Dr. North, and they're somewhat complicated slides, but I'll try to make the point. Disaster mental health framework, one is case identification, right? So when we're doing psychological first aid, and that's sort of purple square in the upper left, the individual post-disaster mental health assessment. Hopefully we're finding that most people are okay, and we don't expect them in the weeks to come to develop psychiatric issues. We might find some people that had pre-existing psychiatric issues, or it'd be an absolute crisis. Or we may find people that had a high exposure but are doing okay right now, but because of the level of exposure or other risk factors, we want to follow them in the weeks to come, or refer them for follow-up, even if they're fine right now. Then in relation to that, the other part of disaster mental health framework is triage and referral, right? So this is a different way of looking at that, right? But who gets referred to formal mental health services on the right, that's what MH is, or who just gets basic psychosocial interventions like psychological first aid. If they don't have a psychiatric disorder, which most people should not up front, if they're not in crisis, which this defines as suicidal or homicidal or psychotic, and they don't ask for mental health services, then psychological first aid is the way to go. And even most people that ask for mental health help, psychological first aid, particularly the listening and supportive part of it, may be good enough. One comment on this slide about psychiatric crises: suicidality is extremely rare. When people have studied suicidality right after an event, very few studies have actually found that that's the case. Even though people worry a lot about the potential for suicidality, it's generally not been found to be the case. A lot of people asking existential questions about the meaning of life and how they can go on, let's say in their damaged town, or having lost a loved one, but that may not actually be a psychiatric crisis. And then finally, interventions. So, right, so psychosocial interventions are on the left, formal psych services are mental health services on the right. Early on in the days certainly, maybe weeks after an event or an ongoing event, we're talking about psychosocial interventions, not formal psych interventions, but basically psychological first aid, which might involve debriefing or crisis counseling or psychoeducation, but it's the basics. Down the road, or in the rare cases initially, we're talking about formal mental health services, the stuff that as mental health professionals, most of whom are the people that provide psychological first aid after a disaster, are used to providing psychotherapy, medications, etc. That's typically for down the road, not right after. And finally, if you don't remember anything from this presentation, if you don't remember all the different elements of psychological first aid, even though many of them I think are intuitive and what we all tend to do and prioritize naturally, but if you don't remember anything I said, this is the most important slide. In 2007, they got together a bunch of experts in trauma and disaster and asked them, what are the key elements for intervening in a mass trauma? What are the key themes for catastrophic events? And this is what they came up with: promoting a sense of safety, promoting calming, promoting a sense of collective self-efficacy, empowerment, connection, and hope. Promoting those things, right? If we do those things, however we want to do them, forgetting the technical aspects or whatever aspect, or whatever techniques we do, that is psychological first aid. That is what we hope to do for one another after a mass traumatic event, in order to minimize people's current distress, maximize their function, and minimize the chances that whatever distress or dysfunction they're having now, down the road would become a psychiatric problem. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you found this to be a useful presentation, and good luck in your work.